Episode 1, The Surveillance State, hosted by Laurie Dhue. We are not getting journalism.
The media bias, I guess, just depends on which channel you watch.
The mainstream media has gone over.
Washington is broken.
They can't stand the truth, and apparently...
And more people are watching media that affirms their own point of view.
I can't believe anything that they say. I just really can't.
I think that we need a different point of view other than the Republican and the Democratic Party.
Welcome to the first episode of For the Record. I'm Laurie Dhue. Our society is completely dependent on electronic communications. Most of us wouldn't dream leaving the house without our cell phone, smartphone, or tablet. We Americans send more than 6 billion text messages every day. But before you send your next text or email or make that next call, there's something you should know. When you send that message or connect on that call, there's a very strong possibility that your words are being tracked, analyzed, and archived in places you don't even know about. So who is collecting all this information? It's not the Russians, and it's not the Chinese. It's the U.S. government. Within the last few months, there's been a flurry of headlines that no one seemed to pay much attention to. Just a few months ago, Google revealed that it had received more than 13,000 government requests for information on American citizens, including copies of emails. More than half of those requests were made without a warrant. Early last year, the Wall Street Journal reported that Attorney General Eric Holder had granted the National Counterterrorism Center sweeping authority to copy and store information on U.S. citizens. And 2 years ago, the U.S. government quietly opened a mega data center at Lackland Air Force Base in Texas. It was designed to collect an unlimited amount of information. Later this year, another enormous data collection facility will become operational in the state of Utah. More on that later. So what exactly is going on? How much of your privacy is being violated? For the Record has learned that the attacks of 9/11 led to a massive change in our government. During those early days of our national crisis, decisions were made in secret that changed America forever. Decisions that are now robbing you of one of your most basic rights.
Very dangerous. My name is Thomas Drake. I was born in Louisiana, and I grew up in Texas and Vermont. I completed my Air Force degree, and I also went on to get a 4-year degree from the University of Maryland, a master's from the University of Arizona in Tucson. I used to work at the DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, as a reserve intel officer back in the 1990s, shortly after the collapse of the wall. I actually at one point worked at the CIA as an imagery analyst during the late 80s for a short period of time before I became a contractor. NSA historically was a very closed culture. You did not even tell your neighbors, in some cases not even your spouse, what you did or where you worked. It was actually brought into being during the Truman administration in 1952, which most of that presidential directive is still secret to this day. What you need to understand about NSA is that there are extraordinary Americans that work there, largely in silence. NSA is a very large agency. The actual number of employees, to include military, is classified, but it's in the tens of thousands. The main role of NSA traditionally is to conduct foreign intelligence, outward-facing electronic surveillance, communications intelligence, electronic intelligence, and it's called SIGINT, Signals Intelligence. Working at NSA, some call it a digital fortress. It has 3 levels of security. It's got barbed wire. It has dogs. It's got black suited special security driving around. It's got passive and active monitoring. It takes a lot to get through to even go into the buildings at NSA, to hundreds and thousands of people spread out across a very large campus. However, what's interesting, it's very stark in terms of the halls. You don't see a whole lot of the certain security posters. All of the activity is normally behind closed doors, even at NSA. Their historical strength was skunkworks operations, very small teams focused almost obsessively, compulsively so, on solving problems. It was truly a technical engineering organization for signals intelligence. That began to change in the 1980s, but accelerated after the end of the Cold War. There was tremendous pressure on NSA to hire outsiders to stir up what was euphemistically referred to as the gene pool. So new thoughts, new thinking, necessary to meet the challenges of the 21st century. They went to careerbuilders.com, monster.com, and I applied for one of the positions that they advertised in February that I saw and read about in the Washington Post. 6 months later, I was offered a position. And I did actually have a colleague of mine, a contract colleague, who questioned my sanity in joining NSA as a senior executive. And he actually said, "Tom, I think you're on a suicide mission." I did not realize at the time how sentient those words truly were, particularly with what I ended up finding out while at NSA shortly after 9/11.
My name is Kirk Wiebe.
My name is Bill Binney. I was born in western Pennsylvania, in a small town, and I grew up in that small town and went to college at Penn State University in central Pennsylvania.
I'm originally from northern Indiana, although born in Chicago. My parents moved to northwestern Indiana, a town called Chesterton, around 1946, and I was raised there until I graduated from high school and joined the United States Air Force. The Air Force sent me to Russian language school, 8 hours a day for 9 months at Indiana University.
My area major, I started out as a chemistry major, but 2 years in, when we were in an organic chemistry lab, the lab blew up. So I thought that was a dangerous occupation, so then I switched to mathematics, where I thought, what could you do with a pencil, you know?
I returned to Indiana University in 1972 to work on a master's in Russian, received that in 1974, wrote the National Security Agency to see if they were still interested in Russian linguists. Indeed they were. And in June of 1975, after receiving my clearance, security clearance, I entered duty with the National Security Agency.
Between 2001 and 2002, for approximately 10 months, I reported to the Signals Intelligence Director. Her name was Maureen Baginski. The first day I reported to work after administrative in-processing, taking the oath of office for the 4th time in my government career, twice in the military and once in the CIA, my first day on the job was 9/11.
A plane has crashed into the World Trade Center. We don't know anything more than that. We don't know if it was a commercial aircraft. We don't know if it was a private aircraft.
I was riding in my car on the Baltimore Beltway when I became aware of the news that a plane had struck the World Trade Center. I arrived at the agency, parked, ran in, and like everybody else, we were all watching the news.
4 U.S. commercial jetliners were hijacked. 2 crashed into the World Trade Center here in New York City.
NSA really had no information, at least at first blush, as to who had carried out this heinous attack.
The first attack ever on the Pentagon occurred at 9:38 a.m. Eastern Time.
I remember standing up. I literally said out loud, "America is under attack." And then the next 4 months were a blur.
I watched the plane hit the tower, and I said, we failed. That was just obvious. We failed as an intelligence agency and an intelligence community. We just failed.
It's important to note that NSA didn't actually have a whole lot of people on the terrorism issue. I live with the certainty, particularly what I discovered later, that critical information was never shared with national command authorities. Critical information was never shared in which senior intelligence officials, up to and including the heads of other intelligence agencies, as well as the President of the United States.
If you're asking me whether or not 9/11 could have been prevented, I would say absolutely. There's no excuse for it. What we wanted to do with the program Thin Thread was introduce it into the system so that it would automatically execute certain things. If they got some kind of tip that some terrorist was in the country or something, everybody would be alerted. FBI, everybody. There was no question about it. It would automatically execute with rules electronically.
My name is Diane Rourke, and I was a professional staff on House Intelligence Committee for 17 years. And for the last 5 of those years, I had the National Security Agency account. And I decided to give some money to the Thin Thread system.
Thin Thread was tested by approximately 5 independent technical review panels and found to be a viable way forward for the National Security Agency.
When 9/11 occurred, those of us who knew about it felt really terrible about the death of 3,000 people. We felt that we probably could have prevented it if Thin Thread had been deployed as we had hoped it would be.
As I sit here again, I'm at this memorial, the first time I've been here. 3,000 people were murdered, absolutely murdered. And we didn't stop it. We didn't stop it. And it could have been stopped.
In the business of government, there is a direct correlation between money and power. The better funded you are, the more power you have. In the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, the intelligence community was looking for more, and not surprisingly, got it. Lots of it. Billions of taxpayer dollars were poured into the NSA budget. The agency was expanding, and so was its unconstitutional reach into the lives of American citizens.
Lieutenant General Michael Hayden has been the director of the National Security Agency since March 1999.
In the hours just prior to the attacks, NSA did obtain 2 pieces of information suggesting that individuals with terrorist connections believe something significant would happen on September 11th.
General Hayden, then the director of NSA, he arrived in March of 1999 when Thin Thread was already under development. He decided to launch a program called Trailblazer. Trailblazer was a concept. It wasn't hardware and software running.
When I hear the words Thin Thread and Trailblazer, I'm reminded of the stark difference between the multi-billion-dollar boondoggle of Trailblazer and the very best of American ingenuity that spent $3 million creating Thin Thread. And Thin Thread was operational, it was ready to go operational well before 9/11, and it was never given the chance.
The problem with it was, for General Hayden, as far as I could tell, was it threatened his massive program, over a $4 billion program called Trailblazer, which meant there were many contractors around the community in Washington who were dependent on living off that program, taking in money.
So they brought in a bunch of large, what we affectionately call beltway bandits, large corporations that typically have large contracts with the federal government, Department of Defense, and the intelligence community to solve the problem of network communications and the mass of data that they carry.
The concern that started to bother me was really in early 2000, when it was clear that they wanted to kill Thin Thread and any automation attempts or solving the problem became the issue. In other words, my impression was that their whole objective was to keep the problem going so the money would keep flowing.
And after 9/11, the money just flowed. The spigot was turned on, and so everybody made a lot of money. Everybody was pretty happy, even if the contractors didn't think it was the right system. They went along with it. They made a lot of money. The people at NSA who had those accounts, the more money they handled, the more people that they supervised, the better their career was. So it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy as long as the money keeps flowing.
That most of the leadership at NSA went into denial. And I remember when I was accompanying Marine Baginski going around the various campus locations at NSA, attempting to help people understand just what had happened and what our response would be. actually saying in a meeting that 9/11 was a gift to NSA. We're now going to be able to get all the money we would ever want because of 9/11.
I protested. I said it was a time for leadership. They would just waste the money. And we had to, this was the time to step up and make sure they did it right. And I was told that I was naive and that we would be blamed if another attack occurred. And I said, yes, I agree, we will be blamed, but this is the right thing to do. And, but what turned out was that they got all the money they wanted.
Many millionaires can owe their financial status to Trailblazer and other governmental programs, all paid for with taxpayer money.
The American taxpayer just got taken to the cleaners.
It was quite something to see people coming to me, even when I was still at NSA, saying, Tom, you got to cash in on this. There's a lot of money to be made. And all I'm thinking about is we had failed the nation. And the very best of America had never been put into the fight, but it was there to do so.
A lot of the failure in the Trailblazer program was in the fact we were trying to overachieve. We were throwing deep and we should have been throwing short passes, if you want to use the metaphor. And that a lot of the failure was we were trying to do too much all at once.
Trailblazer was a multi-billion-dollar boondoggle. It never actually developed anything. It just spent all kinds of money. Thin Thread was developed with the very best of American ingenuity and innovation. Not only would it have provided superior intelligence, actionable intelligence, warning intelligence, both pre and post 9/11, but it fully honored not just the letter of the law, but it was in full accordance with the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act.
The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, known as FISA, was passed in 1978, largely in response to the findings of the Church Committee. The Church Committee was a committee convened by the Senate to look into the really extreme surveillance abuses that took place in the 50s and 60s and even the 70s. FISA was designed to regulate foreign intelligence surveillance to prevent those abuses from happening again.
That's not as much a concern as what's called the FISA Amendments Act, which took all of the changes that were created after the 9/11-2001 attacks, when President Bush said that what Congress passed to deal with terrorism gave him free rein to change our national security apparatus.
The FISA Act not only legitimated everything President Bush had told me, almost everything President Bush had told me to do under his Article II authorities as Commander-in-Chief, but in fact gave the National Security Agency a great deal more authority to do these kinds of things.
What I discovered shortly after 9/11 is that NSA had embarked on a program, and they did call it the program, in which they turned the United States of America into the equivalent of a foreign nation for the purposes of vast dragnet electronic surveillance.
After 9/11, not only did the money spigots open up, but I eventually found out that there was illegal domestic surveillance against American people. It was not only illegal, it was also unconstitutional. I was very, very alarmed. I thought at first it must be a rogue operation because I couldn't believe that this would be done.
And I remember several people telling me in those short couple of weeks after 9/11, what are we doing, Tom? We're not supposed to be spying on Americans, let alone treating the United States as the equivalent of a foreign nation. And several were horrified.
I was very alarmed. I first went to my committee and I wanted to make this a bipartisan thing. I did not want some people to be, I was afraid the Republicans would defend President Bush for doing this. And so I went to both the Democratic and the Republican staff directors, and I thought they would stop it. But it turns out that the chairman and the ranking member, who at that time were Porter Goss and Nancy Pelosi, had actually gone along with it.
In mid-October 2001, the contractors I had working for me in the SIGINT Automation Research Center came to me and said that they were ordered to set up a separate process in another rooms with a lot more equipment, which I'd seen come into the building. And they were now taking in hundreds of millions of records of U.S. communications provided by the telecoms into NSA. Well, that was a direct violation of the Constitution, Fourth Amendment, and even the Fifth Amendment, because they're using that data against people.
After 9/11, the domestic surveillance program collected a lot of information on U.S. communications of many different types, but also collected other personal information and databased it. And the other aspect of it is that this information is being retained indefinitely. So your information, all of our information from 10 years ago is still there.
And then I had that dramatic conversation with one of the attorneys in the Office of General Counsel the first week of October of 2001. It was made starkly clear, NSA is the executive agent for the program. And we knew what the name of the program was. It was called Stellar Wind. It's all been approved by the lawyers. The White House has signed off on it. Don't ask any more questions, Mr. Drake. You don't want to go there. And I knew in that moment that I was now eyewitness to the subversion of my own Constitution.
I went to General Hayden and talked to him about it because of my great concern over the unconstitutional nature of it. And I asked him if they were getting a warrant for surveillance of U.S. persons. And he admitted that they were not. This was both unconstitutional and illegal under the laws at the time.
This was incredibly contentious. Incredibly contentious. Now, was it legal? You bet. The FISA Appellate Court has ruled on this twice, and let me quote you one of the rulings from the FISA Appellate Court. It's called in re sealed. We take as a given that the President has inherent constitutional authorities to conduct electronic surveillance without a warrant for foreign intelligence purposes. Okay, so in terms of lawfulness, I'm fine. Politically, this is a nuclear detonation.
The letter and the intent of the Fourth Amendment is no longer in force. And I would tell you, it's totally unnecessary. We know how to find bad guys in data and protect the privacy rights of Americans. We know how to do it. The government doesn't want to do it that way. The question is, why? They want the ability to look at Americans when they feel like it, for whatever reason. And that's the threat we now live with.
The Fourth Amendment is not a nicety. It's first and foremost a recognition that police and the security forces protect us best if they don't begin with an assumption of suspicion, an assumption of guilt.
We're not separating the judicial from the police, which is really what the Fourth Amendment intended. So I think we have to do good police work, follow the Fourth Amendment, go after bad people, but not call up millions of records of innocent people while looking for one bad person.
I think the founders would be shocked to see how the government is conducting surveillance today, given the words they wrote in the 1700s. The Fourth Amendment is pretty clear in what it says, and it's pretty clear in the importance it places on having a check between the government and Americans' papers and effects.
We're doing essentially what James Otis complained of. James Otis was one of our founding fathers, and in the 1760s and on, he complained about general warrants. General warrants were where the king just said, you can go look in any colonist's house anytime you want, and you don't have to have a specific warrant. So when we wrote the Fourth Amendment, we said, you have to name the person, you have to name the place, and you have to have probable cause.
That's what the Fourth Amendment is all about. It's not a restraint on police because we don't trust them. It's a restraint on police because they're human.
We have a special court. We even have a secret court. The FISA court is secret, and I understand there has to be secrecy sometimes, but they have judges on there, and the judges are supposed to look at both sides of things. They almost never have turned warrants down.
Shortly after 2001, President Bush authorized the NSA to ignore the secret court that the NSA is supposed to go to when it acquires Americans' international communications. And when that was exposed as being a clear violation of the law, Congress responded by codifying that system of warrantless surveillance into law and by providing retroactive immunity to the telecommunications companies that cooperated with the government.
People are so fearful of terrorism that they're willing to throw out the Constitution, and I think that's a real problem. You know, there was the Franklin statement, those who, you know, want security and will exchange their security for freedom will have neither, and that is my concern with this.
After 9/11, we departed from our core values, but President Obama has continued the policies of warrantless surveillance and other violations. It's not a partisan issue. This is a problem for the Constitution, it's a problem for the rule of law, and it's one that all Americans should be concerned about. The difficulty we've had is convincing both Congress and the courts that they have meaningful roles to play in patrolling executive overreach.
It raises the specter of not just the surveillance state, but the ability of the state to know everything there is to know about you in secret. If history is any guide, that's a form of government to which I took an oath to resist.
I took an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States. And that oath, I think, plays a very important part in terms of the actions we took later to whistleblow on corruption at the National Security Agency.
If your boss broke the law and you knew about it, would you have the courage to turn them in? Any federal employee who decides to risk it all and expose the government for waste, corruption, and violating the U.S. Constitution knows they will face the wrath of their superiors. For the NSA whistleblowers, the only thing they had to gain was the right to expose the truth.
As a result of finding out the NSA was an abject violation of the Constitution, I was faced with the dilemma of what would I do. I chose to make a fateful decision and fight from within. And I remember in December when Saxby Chambliss, who headed up a rather new subcommittee for the House Permanent Subcommittee on Intelligence, chose to open up an investigation into 9/11. And I became a whistleblower and material witness for that investigation.
We had been hired and gave our all on the job, and all three have received many promotion recommendations and awards and etc. during their careers. But we had reached a point where no longer could the actions of our employer mesh with the convictions, the principles, and the oaths we had taken to uphold the Constitution of the United States. So on Halloween Day of 2001, we left the building.
I worked 23 years in intelligence oversight or intelligence, and I was pretty burnt out, frankly, at the end, especially by the NSA experience.
In September of 2002, Kirk Wiebe, Ed Loomis, Diane Rourke, and I signed a complaint that we filed with the Department of Defense Inspector General's office, filing a complaint about corruption, fraud, waste, and abuse in NSA with the program Trailblazer and the destruction of the program Thin Thread.
NSA was very uncooperative, as I had expected they would be. And Tom Drake actually saved the effort because he helped them considerably and showed them where the information was that they had been unable to find.
I became a material witness and whistleblower for that investigation, providing prima facie evidence of what NSA knew, could have known, should have known, and had not shared.
I would say that the federal government is capable of doing some very good things for the American people. But I would caution that the federal government is also capable of using its powers for dark reasons.
I had used every avenue available to me within the government to report high crimes and misdemeanors. In 2005, a blockbuster article came out in the New York Times written by Eric McLeod and James Risen, investigative reporters, revealing for the first time publicly the existence of the so-called warrantless wiretapping program.
The president himself ignited the firestorm yesterday with his confirmation that he allowed the National Security Agency to bypass the courts and secretly eavesdrop on the emails and phone calls of people in the United States.
When the article in the New York Times came out about the warrantless wiretapping program, I said, well, there's obviously somebody leaking it. It wasn't, I mean, I didn't talk, at that point I had never talked to anybody in the news.
That caused an extraordinary stir and a massive response to find the leakers.
It was the 2005 New York Times article that actually triggered the investigation into the five of us, being myself, Ed Loomis, Bill Binney, Tom Drake, and Diane Rourke. Because we had worked closely to the subject area that the article talked about in the New York Times, namely the warrantless wiretap program.
I did not leak information about the warrantless wiretap program to the New York Times.
I had nothing to do with the New York Times. I had nothing to do with those reporters. And I knew when that article came out, it was just the tip of the iceberg. I was faced with a crisis of conscience. But the stakes were so high because of what the dirty knowledge of NSA that I had had for so many years. I chose to go to the reporter at the Baltimore Sun.
I did subsequently talk to the Baltimore Sun, to Siobhan Gorman, and I did so in large part because General Hayden told me that I could do that. He tried to keep me from objecting to it anymore and said that after it leaked, as he knew it would eventually, because it appeared to be so illegal, that after it leaked I would be able to, quote, yell and scream and wave my arms all I wanted.
It's fair to say that NSA, although they already had a Department of Justice criminal leak investigation because of the New York Times article, became even more concerned. And I knew that I would ultimately get caught up in the investigation.
I was sitting at the desk behind me here. I happened to look up and saw people in dark blue uniforms with the gold letters FBI walking across the front yard.
At 6 o'clock in the morning, they banged on my door and finally woke me up and raided my home.
They came in with us with guns drawn and pointed guns at us. You know.
About 12 to 15 FBI agents were standing on the porch, and they fanned out all over the house and went through absolutely everything.
To go through that experience feels like 50 colonoscopies all scheduled on the same day.
But their motivation was to keep us quiet. They wanted to keep us quiet, but that was a big mistake for them. Because when they came to do that, and they told me, tell me something that will implicate someone in a crime, that was my opportunity. Because the only crime I knew of was what they were doing internally in NSA, spying on U.S. citizens. So I said, okay, President Bush, Dick Cheney, Hayden and Tenet conspired to subvert the Constitution and any number of laws. They did it with the program Stellar Wind. Here's the data they got from telecoms, and this is what they're doing with that data. And I laid it all out on my back porch to a bunch of agents of the FBI who were not cleared.
I did talk to the Baltimore Sun, but I never gave any classified information. There was plenty of information on the computer indicating that I had no intention of doing that and that I hadn't. I think in the end they didn't care whether we were innocent or not. They just wanted to string somebody up so that everybody would be warned that they should never give anything embarrassing about the government to the press, or this could happen to them. They could be destroyed just like Tom Drake was destroyed.
In May of 2010, I became Thomas Drake's attorney. That was shortly after he was indicted.
I was targeted. It's quite something. You sit at home and see a dozen agents streaming across your front yard armed. And the rap on the door. I remember my throat, heart went up my throat going, here we go.
Tom Drake was facing a 10-count felony indictment, largely under the Espionage Act.
In April of 2008, I was asked to go to a classified FBI facility in the greater DC area. And that's when the chief prosecutor at the time confronted me. And I still remember that moment where he looked at me and in no uncertain terms said, Mr. Drake, how would you like to spend the rest of your life in prison?
When the government decides to go after you, it unleashes the full force of the entire executive branch. In the case of the NSA whistleblowers, that meant 5 full-time prosecutors and 25 FBI agents over a period of 5 years in an investigation that's still ongoing today.
Well, the power of government's enormous. You know, people used to talk about, fighting City Hall. Try fighting a $3.8 trillion government when they come after you.
because the government meme was so strong about the egregious felonies that they alleged I had done, that most of the media took it at face value, that I was a traitor, that I had disclosed information that would harm the national security of the United States.
Basically, they paint a caricature of you, and you don't recognize a person that they describe.
I knew I faced the worst possible thing an American could face, being charged as a spy by my own government.
And I remember telling them, Tom, the truth is on your side. There's a whole army of co-workers and people on your side, people who know you. You'll get through this. The truth will be your friend.
Would the truth prevail? Was it sufficient in a court of law?
You know, I feel like it was a process for people to realize that Tom Drake was a whistleblower and not a criminal. I felt like the beginning step was when he won the Rittenhour Prize for truth-telling, because then it was like this guy who's being charged with making false statements just won a prestigious award for telling the truth. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to introduce Tom Drake.
What a tribute to receive the Rittenhour Truth-Telling Prize as a whistleblower.
I think that continued with The New Yorker, and the momentum continued with 60 Minutes. I felt like those were watershed moments where the court of public opinion really began to understand Tom as a whistleblower that he is.
Why do you think you were charged under the Espionage Act? That's pretty rare.
To send a chilling message. The 60 Minutes special, as well as the Jane Mayer article, and then two very powerful Washington Post editorials taking the government to task that maybe they had overreached a bit, by the time we got to the first week in June, had turned the tide. Ultimately, the government abandoned their approach. They chose to enter into plea negotiations under the proviso they would drop all 10 felony counts. And I ended up pleading to a minor misdemeanor, the equivalent of spitting on the sidewalk at NSA.
Tom Drake's sentencing was supposed to be a very pro forma event. He already knew what he was going to be sentenced to.
The judge took the government to task for having put me through hell, and it didn't pass the smell test, and it was unconscionable that we don't do this in this country. And he actually cited the very foundational basis for our own revolution.
How our country was founded against general warrants of the British, like were used on Tom Drake. It was such a cataclysmic moment in the courtroom. You could hear a pin drop. It was amazing to hear that kind of vindication from Judge Bennett, but it came at a very high price.
I now look forward to initiating my life back so I can live free again, knowing that freedom is never free.
I can't even begin to describe the kind of physical, psychological, spiritual, emotional toll that it takes on someone.
I have many colleagues who will no longer see me. There's only a couple of people who I used to work with who will even talk to me anymore. I've had to create a whole new life. It hasn't been easy. My personal life is shattered.
That's one thing we could address legislatively, and that is to protect whistleblowers, people who are trying to let the people know.
Whistleblowers are having a very tough time now under the Obama administration. I think it's even worse than it was under the Bush administration.
It's extremely troubling that those who have sought to expose violations of the law have been investigated and in some cases prosecuted, while those who engaged in the violations of the law at the outset have largely not been investigated at all.
Unfortunately, in the national security field, and particularly in the intelligence community, whistleblowers have very little protection. And it's in that area where you need them most.
Thomas Drake won his battle against the government. He was declared a truth teller and not a criminal. But what did he win? What changed? Nothing. The unconstitutional behavior of the NSA and its surveillance programs hasn't stopped. It has continued and has actually expanded. In fact, the agency collects and stores more information on Americans now than ever before.
It's free. I'm running like on my way home. I'm just getting off of work.
We've made so many things secrets. It's secret how much money we spend on NSA programs, which has kind of gone overboard. It's secret, you know, how many Americans have been snooped on. Why would we make that secret? And how can we ever restrain or correct abuses if it's secret how many people are being snooped upon by the NSA?
There's a town in Utah called Bluffdale, and located there is a huge construction project involving some 100,000 square feet of space that those of us who have been in the business for a while believe will be used for the massive storage of communications information, emails, phone calls, Facebook records, internet records, purchase records, whatever, will be stored there for reference by the U.S. government when it feels the need.
It's called the Utah Data Center. It'll cost $1.5 billion and use as much electricity as 30,000 homes.
But the spy agencies aren't saying much about what the place will actually do.
Well, I can't go into all the details of the Utah Data Center. We don't hold data on U.S. citizens.
A number of years ago, NSA made a decision, which I was aware of when I was still there, that they wanted to create a dark cloud for their information. And they chose Utah.
Well, the reason that people in the United States need to worry about the facility at Bluffdale is because all the data that they're doing, all their electronic data, and I assume banking as well as Twitter and credit card, all that kind of information is being stored there. So their entire electronic life can be laid out in a timeline.
One, we don't do that. Two, if you think about just the volume of U.S. emails, just think statistically, just for 1 minute, think. That's, you know, we're talking about, you know, probably 30 trillion emails a year or more. Anybody read 30 trillion? Think about how that is.
And all that's assembled by code, by the way. It's not they don't need humans to assemble a timeline. That's done by code. That was a code designed to do that.
As technology has developed, it has become almost trivial for the government or really anyone to store vast quantities of information.
It has been the greatest privilege and honor in my career to work with the people there at NSA. They take protecting your civil liberties and privacy as the most important thing that they do in securing this nation. And so when people just throw out, oh, they're going to have all this stuff at Utah Data Center, that's baloney.
It's also used as a bully thing. It's like, if you're questioning any intelligence gathering, you're not patriotic. You don't care about your country. You don't care about defending your country.
It's extremely troubling because we don't know precisely what the NSA is doing with these facilities. But we know that given the capabilities of these facilities, there's a real threat that they're using the facility in Utah to store vast quantities of Americans' intimate information.
The FBI Director Mueller said he's got access to this database, that he said technology database. He was testifying on the 30th of March of 2011 to the Senate Judiciary Committee.
We put into place technological improvements relating to the capabilities of a database to pull together past emails and future ones as they come in, so that it does not require a individualized search. So putting together a technological improvement to enhance our capabilities.
He said he's got together with the Department of Defense and created this technology database that he said we can now go in and with one query, we, the FBI, can make one query and get all past emails or future emails as they come in of any person. That would mean that since it's email and the Department of Defense, that's NSA's collection, okay? It's electronic collection. So that's NSA, and he's going into the Stellar Wind database to do that.
When has the government gone too far? How much data is enough to do the job? In this regard, the NSA is collecting large amounts of data, and I've been told by Bill Binney, who's a mathematician, that his estimates are you could store about 100 years of the world's internet data in that facility.
And they're using NARIS devices to acquire it, like Mark Klein testified to, and it's in court records now, of the NSA room in the AT&T facility in San Francisco.
The major internet cables that carry everybody's internet traffic, phone conversations, email, were run through this splitter, and what all the splitter does is make a copy of the entire data stream. It does not select anything in particular. It makes a copy, and that copy is sent down to the secret room. That's what the engineering documents show.
That is where they're storing everything about you. Everything about you, your family, your friends, the whole country. It's not just storage for foreign intelligence, it's storage for domestic intelligence.
So from my perspective, that's just ludicrous. Now, I'm not going to come out and say, well, here's what we're doing at Utah. That would be ridiculous too, because it would give our adversaries a tremendous advantage. We're not going to do that.
The problem is that there is little information today that the NSA cannot acquire if it wants to. It can acquire all of your emails, all of your phone calls, any information that you store digitally in the cloud, any information relating to your location that's collected by your cell phone company, provided by your smartphone or your regular phone. There's little information beyond the grasp of the NSA.
I used to be told after 9/11, you don't understand, Tom. We just need the data. And so this facility, with the advances in technology, where you can put a terabyte of information on your thumbnail, will have the capacity to store just about everything there is to know and be able to access that at will.
As surveillance laws continue to expand and data storage facilities continue to be built, will there be a constitutional challenge? In February, the High Court ruled 5-4 that Americans can't sue to challenge the 2008 expansion of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Since 9/11, U.S. citizens have been trading more of their privacy for security. The question is it worth it? Thank you for joining us. For the record, I'm Laurie Dhue.